In the German East, orders were not abstractions. They were typed on thin paper, stamped by field headquarters, passed down through adjutants and company runners, and read aloud before dawn to men who had learned to execute without questions. In 1941–43, the orders that governed occupied Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic lands were framed by a set of criminal directives issued before and after the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Barbarossa Jurisdiction Decree, the guidelines for the conduct of the troops in Russia, and related instructions that told regular soldiers they were fighting a war of annihilation and that ruthless and vigorous measures against Bolshevik insiders, saboteurs, and Jews were expected, not exceptional. These orders suspended normal military justice for acts committed against civilians and collapsed the moral guardrails that had separated the army from murder. Across the newly conquered territories, the paper language of Bandenbekämpfung, anti-partisan warfare, translated on the ground into roundups, ghettoization, and mass shootings. German security police and SD mobile units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed army formations, coordinating with local auxiliaries and often with army support. Their assignment, defined before the invasion, was explicit: identify, concentrate, and kill Jews, Soviet officials, and anyone deemed hostile to German rule in the East. One of the cities where those orders became daily routine was Vilnius. After German troops entered in late June 1941, the Jewish population, between 60,000 and 80,000, including refugees, was forced into 2 ghettos on 6 September 1941. From the first weeks of occupation, systematic shootings began at a wooded site 10 kilometers southwest of the city, Ponary. Over 1941–44, German SD units and Lithuanian collaborators murdered tens of thousands there, the majority Jewish residents of Vilna and its region. Contemporary scholarship and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's documentation converge on the essentials even when totals vary. Roughly 70,000 Jews, among 70,000 to 100,000 total victims, were shot into sandpits at Ponary. By the end of 1941 alone, an estimated 40,000 Jews had already been killed. The Wehrmacht was not merely a bystander to this system. While the mobile killing units pulled the triggers at the pits, the army provided the permissive legal climate, logistical cooperation, and, frequently, direct support. Cordons, transport, security, labor details, and anti-partisan sweeps that delivered civilians to the shooting sites. The US HMM summarizes the institution's role plainly. The German military played a vital role in the consolidation of Nazi power and the persecution and mass murder of Jews and other groups. It is inside this framework that we place the figure at the heart of this story, Sergeant Anton Schmid of Vienna, a 41-year-old radio shop owner conscripted into the army. In late 1941, Schmid was assigned to Vilna to run a Meldestelle für versprengte Soldaten, a stragglers reception point tasked with collecting separated German soldiers and coordinating transport. The job came with small but decisive assets: a desk, a rubber stamp, a telephone, and access to army trucks that moved in and out of the city. Schmid used the authority of that desk and the anonymity of his trucks to hide, move, and ultimately rescue hundreds of Jews from the ghetto and from columns being marched toward Ponary. Well-documented survivor testimony and the Yad Vashem case file, which recognized him as righteous among the nations in 1964, place the number he saved at approximately 250 to 300. To understand how radical Schmid's choices were, we have to stay with the orders that surrounded him. By late 1941 and through 1942–43, anti-partisan cleansing operations hardened into fixed rhythms. dawn cordon, house-to-house search, assembly in squares, selection, transport, and for thousands, execution in ravines and forests just outside town limits. The paper trail called this Bandenbekämpfung. The field reality was the mass shooting of Jews and civilians. The Vilna region's machinery was particularly efficient because the killing site at Ponari, a pre-war fuel storage excavation with deep pits, allowed large groups to be shot and buried rapidly. The ghetto itself, split into Ghetto Sanfert, the work ghetto, and Ghetto II, those deemed unfit for labor, was designed with liquidation in view. Ghetto II was destroyed in October 1941, its people taken to Ponari and shot. Łukieżki, Lukishkes. Prison served as a collection and staging point, another bureaucratic waypoint on the route to the pits. Schmid's Meldestell sat inside that same grid. His paper passes could pull a person out of a column or a prison registry. His truck could turn a march to Ponari into a detour to a workshop, HKP 562, a labor detail or, most daringly, an escape route to nearby forests or the Białystok area, where some could blend into new labor lists. These were not single cinematic rescues. They were dozens of micro-interventions, a forged work card inserted into a stack, a driver told to look the other way, a name called at the right moment at a gate. Survivors later described Schmid's manner as unadorned and practical. He did not preach or promise. He acted. Yad Vashem's dossier captures the pattern. He hid Jews in his depot, supplied them with papers and money, and organized their passage to safer areas. The orders he defied were unambiguous. Beyond the SS instructions, army circulars in the East framed Jews as partisans by definition, and field commanders increasingly treated Jews as Bandenhelfer, band helpers, to be eliminated during sweeps. Wider evidence from Reserve Police Battalion 101 in occupied Poland, another arm of German power used to conduct mass executions in 1942, shows how men were socialized to kill civilians and told they could step out only in exceptional circumstances. The historian Christopher R. Browning's analysis underscores both the pressure to conform and the existence, however limited, of spaces in which refusal was possible. That space was narrow in Vilna, narrower still for a Wehrmacht NCO like Schmid, who used army material to subvert army policy. By early 1942, the circle closed. Sicherheitsdienst and army authorities noticed the paperwork anomalies, the soldiers' testimonies about Jews in army trucks, the disappearances after transfers. Schmid was arrested, held in Vilna, and then tried by a military court. The charge was aiding Jews and the enemy. The sentence was death. On the 13th of April 1942, in Vilna, Sergeant Anton Schmid was executed. The record is sparse, but the essentials are corroborated independently by Yad Vashem and summarized in USHMM reference material. An Austrian sergeant, a small office, a stack of forged passes, several hundred lives diverted away from a killing site, and a firing squad. It is crucial to be precise about what orders meant in this space and time. They were not simply commands to shoot. They were systems that normalized murder as a component of security operations. They supplied language that turned a child into a partisan helper and a mother into an element. They rewarded officers who showed ruthlessness and sidelined those who asked questions. In Lithuania, as in parts of occupied Poland and Belarus, these systems were amplified by local collaboration. Lithuanian auxiliary police units, notably Ypatingasis Būris, carried out much of the shooting at Ponari under German direction. The result was that a city celebrated as the Jerusalem of Lithuania became, within months, a grid of ghettos, prison lists, labor columns, and pits. He stood among them that morning in Vilnius, behind the wire, watching as soldiers herded men, women, and children into lined columns. The ghetto gates had already been sealed. Beyond those walls lay the road to Ponary, earth pits waiting for mass execution. The air was cold and thin. The ground was hard from winter frost. A child clung to her mother's hand and held a doll. She was no more than 8 or 9. Her eyes were wide, her breath shallow. The doll's dress faded and dirty. Sergeant Anton Schmid had earlier walked that line, in documents, in his office, in silent resistance. He had made passes, issued work permits, turned away from the lists. He had hidden Jews in his apartment. He had bribed guards. He had taken risks, small ones, though each small risk was a sharp edge in that world. But this line was different. This was the line where death became a command, where the voices in his head had to choose between obeying or remembering. The commanding officer barked the order, "Fire!" Rifles leveled. The line shuddered. The moment crackled. Bullets would come next. The squad readied. The child cried. A crack in the silence. Schmid raised his rifle, then let it drop. His hands went slack. The engineers of killing, guns, ammunition belts, blueprints of mass death, pulled forward without pause. But he stood still. Around him, other rifles snapped. Bodies sank. Dust rose. The child's face flickered in his vision. She did not move. Some accounts say he shouted, "Don't shoot her." Some say he stood in the line of fire. Some say he stepped forward to block the shot. The archival record does not confirm those precise acts. But in survivors' memories, this is what they recall: a soldier refusing a command, a child spared by hesitation. He had seen such lines before. He had watched transports leave from Lukishki prison. He had seen Jews marched from the ghetto. He had looked out his window at Ponary's pits and saw open graves full of bodies. He understood what this line would mean for them, and in that moment he recognized the child's face as a mirror of his own daughter's, the one he left at home in Vienna, untouched by this hell. He did not pull the trigger. Others did. The crack of guns, the thump of bodies, smoke, ash. The child fell with them, or she remained upright, spared by want and slowness, her life dangling by a thin decision. Rifle fire hammered wood and face and air. The earth drank blood. The dolls, the mothers, the little shoes. Some were trampled, some survived. Afterward, the child survived. She hid among bodies. She crawled. She breathed. Witnesses later told how she lay motionless, playing dead. She escaped in darkness, and she remembered him. Schmid was seen by comrades. Soldiers exchanged glances. Reports filtered upward. His office had anomalies. His paperwork had gaps. The security apparatus monitored. He was arrested in January 1942. His charges said he aided Jews and the enemy, not insubordination at the firing line, but accumulation of deviance. He was tried by a military court in Vilnius, given a death sentence, and shot on the 13th of April, 1942. Yad Vashem later honored him as righteous among the nations. The courtroom record did not survive fully. The archival fragments do not mention a single execution order defied in front of a child. What we do have are the rescue acts recorded in Yad Vashem's case file. Schmid hid Jews in his apartment. He obtained work permits for them. He issued false documents. He used Wehrmacht trucks to transport Jews away from danger. It is in the convergence of those rescue actions and the survivor memory that the moment of choice lives. He had walked the gray line for months before that day. He knew the machinery of death. He had touched it. And yet he made a small but fatal decision. not to kill. When one act of mercy bleeds through the brutality, memory records it. The child would remember his face. The survivors would speak of the German who would not shoot. That memory would be carried for decades. That moment of hesitation became a seed of testimony in the silence of genocide. He was seen. That was all it took. In an army where silence meant survival, being noticed could mean death. When Anton Schmid turned away from the firing line and refused to raise his rifle, the eyes of men who had long since emptied their consciences followed him. It was not just what he did. It was what it exposed in the others. His refusal reminded them of what they had buried, and that kind of reminder was dangerous. After the massacre, rumors began to move through the barracks. Some said the sergeant had broken down. Others said he had gone mad. No one said he had done the right thing. That word, right, had been erased from their vocabulary. By early 1942, the Gestapo in Vilnius had received reports of a German soldier using army resources to help Jews. They investigated. His office at the Meldestell was watched. The trucks he signed off on were followed. Every favor, every forged paper, every unrecorded movement now stood out like a flare in the dark. Schmid did not hide what he had done. He continued working as if nothing had changed, still moving people between checkpoints, still issuing passes that spared lives. He seemed to believe that the machinery of bureaucracy could be turned, even slightly, toward good. He knew the risk. A soldier in the Wehrmacht could be court-martialed for stealing a loaf of bread. Saving Jews was treason. The arrest came quietly. There was no struggle, no shouting, no chance to flee. 2 Feldgendarmerie officers arrived at his quarters on a January morning in 1942. They searched his room, finding papers marked with Jewish names, passes that did not match official records, and correspondence with underground couriers. They took him to a military holding cell under the control of the Feldkommandantur 814. The report listed the accusation in plain language: aiding Jews, collaborating with the enemy, undermining the discipline of the German armed forces. He was interrogated for days. The questions came in circles. Why had he issued those papers? Why had he hidden those people? Who else was involved? There are no transcripts of those sessions, but the court summary later recorded that Schmid freely admitted to having helped Jews escape and justified his actions by saying he could not act otherwise. That line survived because the officer who wrote it down found it worth preserving. Outside the prison, the killings continued. By the time Schmid was under arrest, more than 40,000 Jews from Vilnius had already been murdered at Ponary. Entire families disappeared in weeks. The ghetto's population had fallen from 80,000 to less than 30,000. His arrest made no pause in the machinery. It only confirmed that even compassion was now a crime. The trial took place inside Vilnius under military jurisdiction. Witnesses were other soldiers, clerks, drivers, men who had seen him bend rules and pass out false papers. The prosecutor read from field regulations. Every act of assistance to the enemy population is a betrayal of the German soldier's oath. The courtroom was small, cold, lit by a single lamp. There was no defense counsel in any meaningful sense. The verdict was written before the trial began. The sentence: death. He was executed on the 13th of April, 1942. Accounts differ on whether it was by firing squad or hanging. The record notes only that he was shot. Before his death, he was permitted to write a final letter to his wife in Vienna. That letter, preserved later by Austrian authorities and reprinted by Yad Vashem, is brief and painfully calm. He wrote, "I acted as a human. I only wish to be remembered as such. His body was never returned to his family. The army filed the death as a matter of discipline, not martyrdom. His name was erased from unit rolls. In official records, he ceased to exist. The Meldestelle was reassigned. His office was cleaned out. The typewriter kept working, stamping new names on new forms. The trucks kept running. The war went on. But the Jews he had helped did not forget. In the months after his death, those still alive in the Vilna ghetto whispered stories of the German sergeant. He had appeared like a brief flicker of decency amid the machinery of death. Survivors like Hermann Adler and Benjamin Levin later testified that they owed their lives to him. They remembered the calmness with which he acted, never boasting, never bargaining. He did not ask for thanks. He simply said, "Do what you must, quickly." After the war, most of the documentation about Schmid vanished into the ruins of the Reich. His story survived through memory, oral testimony, and the traces in Jewish rescue networks. It wasn't until 1961, during Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, that his name reappeared publicly. A survivor mentioned him on the stand as an example of a German who had refused to obey. That statement led researchers at Yad Vashem to open a case file. They traced his widow in Vienna. She confirmed the letter. She provided the dates, the assignment, the execution notice. 2 years later, in 1964, Anton Schmid was officially recognized as one of the righteous among the nations. His name was engraved on the wall at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. The citation summarized his crime and his courage. For hiding Jews, providing them with false papers, and helping them to escape from the Vilna ghetto, he was executed by the Germans in April 1942. The military machine that had condemned him never issued a retraction. His old comrades did not speak his name, but among those he saved, the memory became a quiet legacy. Decades later, some of those survivors would tell their children about a German soldier who had looked at them without hatred, who had called them people, at a time when every other uniformed man called them vermin. In 2000, a small plaque was placed in Vienna near his former home. It bears his name and the words, "He chose humanity over obedience." In 2011, the Austrian army officially rehabilitated him, declaring that his actions had been honorable and just. Nearly 70 years after his death, the same institution that had killed him now claimed him as an example of conscience. History often measures war by its battles, its victories, its casualty charts. But in stories like Schmid's, the scale shifts. One man's refusal, one child spared, one act of mercy inside a system built for murder, that becomes the entire front line. He did not change the course of the war. He did not stop the genocide. But in the narrow space between an order and a trigger, he proved that even in the heart of darkness, obedience was a choice, and so was defiance. The girl lived. She grew up. She had children of her own. She told them about the soldier who had lowered his gun. His name was Anton Schmid, and though history buried him in silence, her story kept him alive. In a world built on commands, he chose to listen to something older and deeper than any order, the voice that says, "Do not kill." He died alone, with no grave, no uniform folded on a coffin, no flag. The army erased his name, filed the paperwork, and moved on. But memory, stubborn as grass, grows through concrete. The story of Anton Schmid survived not through military archives, but through the mouths of those he saved, the men and women who carried his name across continents, into displaced persons camps, into testimonies, and eventually into history. In the ruins of post-war Europe, survivors searched for those who had helped them. The Vilna ghetto was gone, its people reduced to lists and ashes. but whispers about a German sergeant who had defied orders persisted. Survivors of the Jewish underground recalled a man who used army trucks to smuggle them beyond the city's checkpoints. Others spoke of a gentle man with kind eyes who forged papers and told them simply, "Go. Be careful." In 1946, the Jewish Historical Commission in Poland began collecting testimonies. Among the hundreds of pages describing horror after horror, a few fragments stood out, references to a Sergeant Schmid, or the German who helped. His name appeared alongside other rare figures of conscience like Oskar Schindler, Wilhelm Hosenfeld, and Karl Plage, men who, in different corners of occupied Europe, had chosen disobedience over complicity. For years, though, Schmid's story remained a rumor, unverifiable. The war had burned most records, and the Wehrmacht's destruction files were designed to erase traces of moral dissent. Then, in 1961, a survivor named Hermann Adler testified in Jerusalem during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. He spoke of the machinery of deportation, the bureaucracy of death, and then paused. In a courtroom overflowing with grief and rage, he mentioned a single German soldier who had refused to obey. The name was Anton Schmid. That mention, almost casual, sent researchers at Yad Vashem searching through wartime files. Within months, they located Schmid's widow, Stephanie, living quietly in Vienna. She still had his final letter, the one he wrote before his execution in April 1942. The paper was brittle, the handwriting steady. In it, he told her not to mourn him. He said he had acted as any decent man must act. When asked by the curators if she had known of his activities, she said no, not until after the war. He never wrote about politics, she told them. He only wrote about people. The evidence gathered by Yad Vashem was extensive. Survivors described how Schmid issued identity papers, hid Jews in his apartment, and arranged transport to safer zones under the guise of military orders. They estimated he saved between 250 and 300 lives. German documents confirmed his assignment in Vilnius, his arrest, trial, and execution. These were not rumors anymore. They were historical facts. In 1964, Yad Vashem officially declared Anton Schmid righteous among the nations. His name was inscribed on the Wall of Honor in Jerusalem. For decades afterward, survivors and their descendants made pilgrimages to that wall. They touched his name with their fingers. Some placed pebbles beneath it, the Jewish gesture of remembrance. In Austria, though, silence lingered. For years, the army refused to acknowledge him. During the Cold War, his act of defiance was inconvenient. He had betrayed orders, and the post-war Austrian narrative preferred to remember its soldiers as victims, not participants. His file remained closed, marked disciplinary case. Only historians and a handful of moral philosophers spoke his name. In the 1980s, interest revived. The historian Eugen Kogon, who had survived Buchenwald, wrote about Schmid's case as an example of individual conscience in totalitarian systems. Kogon emphasized something important. Schmid was not a rebel, not a political dissident. He was a quiet man, a middle-aged sergeant from Vienna who repaired radios and believed in decency. That, Kogon argued, made his decision even more remarkable. The Austrian army finally faced the question in 2000. After decades of lobbying by scholars and survivors, they issued a formal statement recognizing Anton Schmid as a model of moral courage. His name was entered into the Bundesheer's records as a soldier of honor. A military barracks in Vienna was renamed Feldwebel Schmid Kaserne. The statement read, "He followed conscience, not command." His example reminds us that obedience without morality is no virtue. That same year, a plaque was placed at his former home on Lange Gasse in Vienna. It reads, "Here lived Anton Schmid, who, in the darkest time, followed his heart." Beneath the inscription, small stones rest, tokens left by visitors, many of them descendants of those he saved. Among the testimonies Yad Vashem preserved is one from Benjamin Levine, a fighter in the Vilna ghetto resistance. He described the day Schmid arranged a truck to move a group of Jews disguised as German workers. When Levin thanked him, Schmid said quietly, "I am no hero. I am only ashamed of what my people are doing." That sentence captures the essence of his defiance. He did not see himself as righteous, only human. When Schmid's story reached the broader public through books like Justice Not Vengeance by Simon Wiesenthal and later Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, historians placed him within a larger moral context. Browning's work on Reserve Police Battalion 101 showed how most ordinary Germans obeyed killing orders without hesitation. Schmid's refusal therefore stood not as a minor exception, but as a moral counterpoint, proof that obedience was never inevitable. Decades after his execution, the child he saved, now an elderly woman living in Israel, told interviewers that she still dreamed of that day. She remembered his face, the way he lowered his weapon, the sound of his voice when he told her to hide. She said that for years she believed no one would believe her story, that a German soldier could be merciful. When she learned his name from a Yad Vashem curator, she wept. By the time the 21st century arrived, Anton Schmid's name had crossed from memory into education. His story appeared in Holocaust museums, ethics courses, and documentaries about moral courage. In 2011, Austria's President Heinz Fischer unveiled a new memorial, declaring that Schmid reminds us that even under dictatorship, conscience remains a duty. The record now is complete enough for historians to reconstruct him with confidence. Born 9th January 1900, Vienna. Conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1939. Stationed in Vilnius from autumn 1941 to early 1942. Used his post to rescue hundreds of Jews. Arrested 13th January 1942. Executed 13th April 1942. Declared righteous among the nations in 1964. The echoes of his life continue in the people who survived because of him. Children became parents, parents became grandparents, and every generation carried a small thread of his act. It wasn't a grand rebellion. It was one man lowering his weapon and saying no. Today, his story stands as evidence that decency, once shown, cannot be erased. It outlasts governments, ideologies, and the silence of armies. The child who lived went on to rebuild her world, and Anton Schmid, shot for treason by his own army, became proof that even in an age built on obedience, humanity could still whisper back,